Welcome to the Elite Dangerous Universe, Commander. My name is Drew Wager, one of the official authors who contributed to the narrative of the game. If you're just starting out and want a guide to the background lore, you've come to the right place. This is the meta lore, the original game of 1984. The Acorn Computer BBC Microcomputer system, the Beeb, or BBC, was the posh kid's computer, and heavily geared to educational use, benefiting from government subsidies and thus appearing in many schools in the 1980s. Gaming was certainly not something its creators had as a primary design goal. It had no sprite hardware like the later Commodore 64, and it was expensive, £335 in 1981, the equivalent of around $1,500 in 2020 prices. It's hard at this stage to return to the pre-elite days of computer gaming in the early 1980s. Back then, games were largely simplistic, clones of arcade games or following very closely in their designs. Games were specifically designed to play through in a few minutes, featuring lives, scores, and levels. There were games that broke this mould, but they were few and far between, and often easily forgotten. The story of Elite starts with Ian Bell having brought such a machine with him to Cambridge University, where he was studying mathematics in 1982. There he met David Braben, studying physics. Both were computer aficionados of a type becoming common in the 1980s. At that stage, Ian was working on the game known as Freefall, which was later published by Acornsoft, a relatively small publishing house compared to the larger Thorn EMI, in 1983. David had written a demo of a 3D wireframe spacecraft and a scrolling starfield on an Acorn Atom, a more primitive precursor to the BBC. This led both to discussions on the limitations of then current game design. They were not the first with the 3D ideas, but they were the first to couple the idea with a purpose, a goal, and something beyond just a score and another go. Elite was born out of the dissatisfaction with the confines of traditional gaming. With no score, what was the purpose? The Thatcherite years of the 1980s provided the answer. Money. But money isn't a score. You can spend money. But on what? Well, upgrades. So your ship had to be inferior to start with. What would be the purpose of upgrading your ship? To defeat other vessels. Why would those other vessels attack you? Because you carried a cargo. So trading was required alongside piracy. There was always a reason for the game mechanics, and the concept developed from there. The true genius, however, lay in providing the player with choices. Yes, there were pirates out there, but you could become one yourself if you so desired. You had moral choices in the game, with no predetermined path. Inspiration from the film Star Wars and 2001 A Space Odyssey are obvious in the action-packed combat and more reserved, if very tense, docking sequences. Even Douglas Adams gets a nod with the mostly harmless rating, so Elite became a microcosm of 80s zeitgeist. Adams would probably have been quite enchanted with the other bit of genius design, applying the limited, but still effective, power of those early 8-bit computers with the observations of one Leonardo Fibonacci, providing a means for a convincing representation of thousands of planetary systems using a technique later dubbed Procedural Generation. Far more data than the machines could actually store in their memories, but repeatable, on demand. Elite, now a working prototype, was pitched to Thorn EMI, one of the biggest games publishers at the time. The result was a disappointment, and a mistake on Thorn's part, similar to the chap from Decca who failed to sign up the Beatles. David and Ian were sent away with the recommendation that they simplify the game, something which would destroy the very essence of what they were trying to achieve. The game was refined further, and the only real goal, that of becoming elite, was added at this stage. The game was originally to be named The Elite, but in conversation it eventually found its ultimate form. The cleverly realised scanner scope was a last-minute addition that required late-in-the-day alterations to the game manual. And the next stop was the aforementioned Acornsoft, with which Ian already had a relationship. They were a small outfit, but to their credit, they grasped the genius of Elite. In a canny move, David arranged for Acornsoft to only have rights to the BBC version, allowing the possibility of lucrative ports to other platforms once the BBC version was released. 2 missions were added, giving a taste of the sort of in-game storytelling that would pave the way for future games. One was to hunt down a stolen Constrictor spacecraft, the other to ferry some top-secret documents across the galaxy while being under constant attack by the Thargoids. Added into this mix was packaging that was significantly more ambitious than was normal for a computer game at the time. Aconsoft really went to town with a manual, keyboard overlays, ship identification charts, and even a specially commissioned novel by Robert Holstock written to set the scene. The Dark Wheel was the starting point for the legends of elites such as Raxler and the Tianisla Orbital Graveyard. Development stopped at some point during the summer of 1984. Thorpe Park, a small amusement park in the UK at the time, was hired out for the launch. It was well in time for Christmas that year, the 22nd of September 1984. Elite garnered gushing and ecstatic coverage in the popular press and television. Success was virtually instant. Ultimately, over 100,000 recognised copies were sold for the BBC Micro alone, and eventually the game would go on to sell something like 600,000 to 1 million copies across all the platforms it was eventually ported to, including the popular computers of the time such as the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and the Amstrad CPC. David's foresight in reserving the rights for other platforms paid off in a big way. The ZX Spectrum version was ported by Taurus and published by Firebird, a brand of British Telecom, with the Commodore version being undertaken by David and Ian themselves. The Commodore version introduced Trumbles, a nod to Star Trek's Tribbles, along with the familiar Blue Danube music while docking. The Spectrum version featured 5 new missions, including supernovas, pirates, rogue asteroids, Thargoids, and cloaking devices. Each version of the game had its own unique foibles and differences to the original BBC version. Ports continued, with the new and more powerful 16-bit machines of the late 80s getting their own versions. The Atari ST, Commodore Amiga, and the PC itself, the NES console, and full circle, the Acorn Archimedes. Apparently there were 16 ports in the end, perhaps one of the most ported games in the history of gaming, lasting well into the early 1990s. Arguably one of the most significant games ever, Elite changed the face of computer gaming dramatically with its combination of believability, considered design, compelling gameplay and longevity. Many tried to ape it, copy it, improve upon it. But an actual sequel didn't arrive until 1993. And when it did, it was a very different beast indeed.